Thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today on the summit, and thank you for the organizers of this summit for inviting all of us to speak here and to attend this session. So let me set the scene. We've got a session on economic frontiers. We're going to talk both about the world and as well as the region. And the scene is as follows. I think if you look at the world global economy, His Excellency the Minister mentioned that the IMF tracks the world in every 6 months and 3 months. At Bloomberg, actually, we track it almost on a daily basis, and we try to see what the data is telling us on a daily basis on the world. And I think on the world, what you're seeing is a global economy that's probably running a bit hot. What does that mean? Growth keeps surprising positively. Growth rates are higher than people tend to expect. Inflation tends to surprise also positively, ends up higher than people anticipate. And as a result, interest rates keep getting higher than people expect it to be. And it's not just economics that's running hot. I think geopolitically, we've got red hot geopolitical sort of environment in the world. Obviously, in this region, there is the war in Gaza that's been going on for the last nearly 7 months now. There's also the Russia-Ukraine war that's been going on for more than 2 years, and also the US-China tensions. And I think against this is a whole backdrop of major factors that are going to shape the world and the global economy and the region over the next years and decades, and I think four are important, and we're seeing their effect already. There is the US-China competition, there is the role of the dollar and its dominance in the global economy and the challenges to that. We saw the expansion of BRICS, for example, last year. There is climate change and what is the impact of that on energy demand, but also on our daily lives. And finally, the fourth factor is AI, artificial intelligence, and how that's going to change the global economy, change the way we work, change the labor market, but maybe even change the social fabric. So a lot of things to cover. Globally on the region. Big questions, but also got big minds here. I'm delighted to have Andrew Torrey here from Visa, Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin from the IMF, the UN, formerly Minister of Investment in Egypt, and Chris Williamson from S&P Global Markets Intelligence. And let me start with you, Chris, because you develop and you also study the PMI surveys, the Purchasing Managers Index surveys, which cover all the major economies, and they give us sort of a timely gauge of what is happening in the world. What are these surveys telling you about the state of the global economy today?
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, the Purchasing Managers Index is an economic indicator we compile. Around 28,000 companies around the world feed us information every month on their business conditions. So it provides a really early snapshot of just how well each local economy and the global economy and the sectors within it are faring. And it has been surprising so far this year. And it's interesting you talk about the risk environment, because just to put this in context, we were having a conversation at S&P Global, which just how risky is the environment at the moment. And we've got lots of colleagues who analyze risk constantly. And I said, have we got a single figure number that we can put on that? We sort of laughed about that concept, how ridiculous it was. But then somebody went away and thought about it and said, actually, we can put a number on it, because we're monitoring 211 economies with their risk, 60 variables of different risk elements within it, and we can weight them all, aggregate them together. And they produced this chart for me showing risk over the last 20 years. 2023 was the riskiest year going forward ever in that history, and 2024 just a little bit less risky. Now, in context, this is way above anything that we'd seen before. And this was at the beginning of the year. So, we're nearly into May. We've seen risk grow even worse. So it's really surprising in that environment. You've got accelerating global growth. So that global PMI has been rising steadily since bottoming out last October. It's indicating a pickup in growth in Europe in particular. It's pulling out the malaise that it had seen in the closing months of 2023. The US continuing a resilient pattern of growth. Japan is starting to accelerate as well. China growth there is accelerating. We published more data yesterday on China's manufacturing sector, showing a further acceleration of growth. Everything is doing well. Everything's picking up. To many people's surprise. So we recently revised up our economic forecast for 2024 to 2.6%. I think the consensus at the moment is 2.4%. So we're above consensus, suggesting that things are brightening on a global picture at the moment.
So we've got a risky environment, things are bright. So obviously one risk that people thought would happen and never materialized is the risk of a recession in the US. I think a year ago, a lot of people would have said the world's largest economy, the US, is going to go into a recession because you had more than 500 basis points of rate hikes, and that typically leads to recessions. So 2 questions here. 1, why did this recession never materialize? And B, what are the surveys telling you about the state of it? Are we going to get a recession in the next 12 months?
To answer the first one, it's complicated, and there's a kind of circular story going on here. So when recession risks were dominant at the end of last year, our surveys were turning down quite sharply. People were suggesting that Europe in particular was going to face a recession, US was cooling. And so what then happened was this very aggressive expectation in markets of rate cuts. So 160 basis points, nearly 1.5 percentage points of interest rate cuts being forecast in the United States and in Europe in 2024. That's what the markets were expecting. Now, on the back of that, financial conditions loosened. So we've seen equity markets rise, we've seen bond markets improve and so forth. We've seen also alongside that the recession risks that were there started to cool the inflation side as well. So we had inflation coming down, we had improved financial conditions that in itself acted as monetary policy easing. So the markets, in effect, did the work of the central bank to some extent late last year. So we saw growth accelerate. The fastest growing sector, PMI show so far this year, has been financial services. That's directly related to interest rate expectations, not what those expectations are. So these looser financial conditions have pulled up financial services. We've seen the cooling of inflation. Yes, price levels are still high, but the rate of inflation, that damaging psychological impact, is starting to moderate. So those two have led to this pickup in growth in the US and in Europe in particular. It's interesting also what His Excellency was saying about tourism, because the last 2 years we've had very strong waves of tourism spending on the back of post-COVID world, and everybody enjoying the ability to travel without having to worry about testing and quarantining. This year, again, see some element of that, not as much as the previous 2 years, but that's also helping drive consumer services spending. So we've got this sort of post-COVID wave that is diminishing, but still picking up in terms of its stimulus on consumers. At the same time, we have these looser financial conditions. And this is where the circularity comes in that perhaps answers the second question. Have recession risk gone? If these interest rate cuts don't materialize, then that stimulus, if you like, of expectation of lower rates is withdrawn, and we can see some setback to growth. Our forecast is not for that to happen, but clearly there's a risk that will subdue growth. And the second big issue to be concerned about, of course, is geopolitical conflict and its impact in particular on energy prices. And we've seen very clearly energy prices can have a damaging effect. Europe is more insulated than it was before the Ukraine war, much more prepared for shocks in the energy system. Nonetheless, if a commodity price shock, an oil price shock drives inflation higher again, then that of course further setbacks the prospect of. In fact, the early April PMI data we saw was showing signs of that energy commodity price impact beginning to hit manufacturing. So in the US now, the strongest inflationary driver in recent months has been the manufacturing sector, not services. So a change around what we saw in 2023.
Thank you, Chris. Dr. Mahmoud, let me turn to you. So the IMF published the World Economic Outlook a few weeks ago. You're an executive director at the IMF, but also one of the most prominent economists from this region and from the global south. How do you see the global economy today? both from your perspective at the IMF, but also as an individual economist.
Right. Thank you so much. It's great to be back to Abu Dhabi, and thank you so much for the kind invitation, and congratulations to John and his team for this great initiative. Wishing him all the success. And it's great to come directly after this, because it seems that we're not in the same world and not in the same ship. There is a fallacy that we are all in the same ship. Actually, he gave an accurate description of the advanced economies, some of the members of the G20. That if I refer to the recent reports coming from the World Bank, and I see my good friend Roberta Gatti here, and from the UN, the Finance for Development, and even from the economic outlook of the IMF, if I go beyond some of the advanced economies, there is a lot to be desired. And actually, it's interesting to listen to the Honorable Minister of the Economy talking about 7% growth as a target. The world is between 3 to 3.2%. Our region, in terms of growth, is much less than that, between 1.5 to 2.5%. If you are focusing on low-income countries, there is an interesting report on low-income countries of IDA, this is the International Development Association, part of the World Bank, with an aggressive, bold, but revealing title that we are in the great reversal by widening gap between the low-income countries. Half of the low-income countries per capita income is far from ever before than what it used to be in terms of gap between the low-income and the high-income groups. Half of the low-income countries are in variety of debt challenges and debt distress. And then when we talk about middle-income countries, many of them are not better than the low-income countries when it comes to access to markets, and they are suffering from debt. Growth is lower than potential, and despite the fact that inflation has come down, that the impact on the cost of living from the last few years of higher inflation left middle class squeezed and more people falling into poverty. So it is not a surprise to see the Finance for Development report that was issued 2 weeks ago by the UN, with a title that we are today can admit that we have development deficit, and actually there is a development crisis. Here, these problems are not going to be reflected on the screens and the markets, because many of these economies are not adequately integrated to have an impact on the advanced economies. The other thing that, unlike what we have seen in the episodes of debt in the past, that the advanced economies are not exposed and like in the past to the debts of developing economies and emerging markets. And the creditors are very different today from the days of 80s and 90s. Paris Club debt is less than 10% today. It used to be 40% in the 80s and 90s and 30% only 20 years ago. So what I'm saying is confirming the other side of the story, where the IMF is saying that, yes, the global growth has shown some resilience, but there is a great deal of unevenness. The part that was adequately described in the case of advanced economies, and then what we see in the rest of the world. And here, three things. Sustainable development is not on track. Only 15% of its targets are on track based on the trajectory. The second thing, that for that to happen, achieving the sustainable development goals would require higher growth. So the 7% mentioned by His Excellency the Minister doesn't have a theory, but has a proof of practice. Is very much trying to push the UAE for that target, because the Growth Commission led by Mike Spence had shown that those who made it post Second World War, from China to Japan to Korea to Singapore, managed to have 7% growth for 25 years. Now we're not seeing these figures, not in Africa,
not in many of the emerging markets, with the exception of India, for instance. Then, from where you can really find growth, it's about investment. Investments in infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, green infrastructure, human capital, education, health, and climate change. But Larry Summers and Professor Singh, and I shared that article with you in Project Syndicate, they said, well, we are in trouble because the net capital flows to developing economies and emerging markets for the first time are turning to be net negative. That proves actually that point, because where the money is going, the money is not disappearing. Actually, the US had a share of capital flows of less than 20% pre-pandemic. Now, its share of capital is more than 33% of the global pool. This has something to do with interest rate, but has something to do as well with the FDI and more investments supported by IRA. The IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, with generous subsidies to the green economy and digitalization, with major spillovers, negative spillovers in many of the developing economies and emerging markets of the capital flows and access to credit and access, more important than money, to technology. So there are lots of issues here. If you are trying to get your country growing in the global south, you are dealing with legacy of low growth, high inflation, high indebtedness, shrinking pool of capital flows, and then you have some negative spillovers, including from some of the green measures, including the IRA of the US, many of the green initiatives of Europe and Japan, and then, of course, the CBAM, the cross-border adjustment mechanism that has some complications on trade. So that makes the lives of ministers of economy and finance of the global south more interesting than what it used to be.
That's very interesting. So there's divergence between advanced economies in the global south. The life of policymakers in the global south, as you mentioned, are interesting. But obviously there is another factor that made it interesting, which is geopolitics.
Yes.
Let's zoom in on a particular part of the global south, which is the Middle East and North Africa. How has the conflict in Gaza that's been going on for the last 7 months, how has it impacted the region or different parts?
Well, what's happening in Gaza is a catastrophe behind what we can't really see of these figures of the ups and downs and on trade, on investment, on insurance risks, on the divergence of trade from the Suez Canal to other routes, and all of that. And that all, there is a tragedy, there is a catastrophe. And I think here, while we're busy with the numbers, we should be very much concerned with the innocent lives that are being lost. And the natural thing to ask for is to ask for peace and end of this unjustified, unjust war. But meanwhile, the impact on growth in the MENA region, and I bet Roberta will be talking about that, have been revised down. Investment flows have been suffering because of some negative signals, and trade costs have been on the increase. The growth have been revised down by the IMF and the World Bank by 0.5 percentage point. But I think even without Gaza, we needed more investments, more stimulus. But then with the Gaza catastrophe, there is a great deal of serious implications. And here, while we are hoping for peace, we need really to push as well some investments in the resilience of the society and the economies to deal with this catastrophe. And then we need really to make sure that the humanitarian support is going in the right direction without delay to Gaza. But it's a catastrophe that beyond the counting and trade, investment, and growth.
Andrew, let me here's to you. So in your role on Visa, you basically oversee 90 countries. That gives you a lot of visibility on large parts of the world, of the global countries, I think. How do you view the world and the global economy from your perspective?
Sure. I get the easy job after these two gentlemen just talked about the bigger macro issues. And, I think we see both of what they're talking about. So if you think about the economy as we ended 2022, there was high inflation, rate hikes, and what we typically see in those is what they're meant to induce is a decline in spending, a decline in investment, certainly then lower economic growth, maybe recessions. And we haven't seen that in 23 at all, really, more broadly. And both of the gentlemen talked about that. What we've seen is consumer spend still is incredibly resilient. We have the ability to look at, we call it Spending Momentum Index, where we've launched it in 8 countries, and the UAE is going to be launched shortly. And what that does is, if you look at the spend in a country, we look at it from a card or a credential, and whether it has increased year over year, whether it's stayed the same year over year, or whether it's dropped year over year. If it's increased, it gets 200 score. If it stayed the same, 100. And if it's decreased, it is 0. So you start to get this spending momentum index. And what we've seen more broadly globally is continued strong consumer spend. There's been some shift in goods, during COVID and when people were locked up, and folks have talked about that. There was certainly an emphasis much more on physical goods. People were buying things for their homes. They were buying computers. And then there's been a shift back now into the segments that are open. So you've seen a real shift to travel. Travel has rebounded significantly. Restaurants, experiences. So we've seen, really, really good growth there. And that momentum, continues. We call 2024 a bit of a great economic reboot, where employment still is good, spending is fairly strong. Now, as Dr. Mahmoud was talking about, there are differences. If you are in an economy, some of the emerging economies, some of the lower income economies that have had significant inflationary pressure, certainly that does hurt households and it does pinch. So we've seen a shift really to essentials. So groceries, energy prices, so, the cost of energy, have really started to impact discretionary spend to non-discretionary spend. So, that's, what we're seeing globally, but still strong, resilient consumer spend.
I have 2 questions. It's very interesting. I have 2 questions on the consumer spending momentum. First, what countries in the region do you cover in that index, if any? And the second,
UAE will be the first one.
First one will be the UAE. Outside this index, if we go from the macro picture to the micro picture, what are consumers spending their money on? What sectors are they spending on, and what sectors are they basically spending less on?
Yeah. So if I go to the region now, GCC, there's been strong growth actually across every segment. If you look at it from 2019 through 2023, you see really, really high consumer spend on electronic payments. Part of it is just digitization away from cash to cards or electronic payments. So you get that wave. So everything's growing, frankly. However, in the growth, you get to start to see some of the sectoral shifts. So, the groceries, which includes, a lot of, order in. So the players of having food ordered in, that's high. You start to see travel, restaurants, lodging, they're going 30, high 20%, transport, education. So a lot of experiential services. And then, it's hard to say that something that's growing in the high teens to low 20s is not good growth, but those sectors are waning a little bit. So basket shifting away from apparel and some physical goods, et cetera, so household goods. So really, that's been that shift in the GCC to groceries, experiences, travel, dining, et cetera.
Oh, that's very interesting. So, Chris, let me just take that question to you, because Andrew mentioned the sort of shift in spending at the pandemic was towards goods away from services, and now more towards services than goods. And you mentioned travel as well, and tourism, and pent-up demand for that. And a lot of people would say that's one of the reasons why we have high global inflation. Is in 2020, you had the supply bottleneck on goods, and now we have excess demand for services, and that tightens the labor market. Is that what you're seeing in the surveys, in the PMI surveys that are closed for for the higher than expected inflation that keeps surprising on the upside?
Absolutely. And there's an element of it's easy to say in hindsight. What we saw through the pandemic and the inflation picture was sort of exactly what you would have expected to see. So first of all, we have a big lockdown of the whole global supply chain system. So what's going to be a consequence of that is obviously very high goods prices, raw material prices through the roof. So a massive impact on both goods inflation. And then when you open up an economy, everyone free to travel, what's going to happen then? Obviously, we're all going to run about like crazy, do all the shopping we want to, go on all the holidays we want to, everyone trying to fit on the same airplane. What's going to happen to those airplane prices? Meanwhile, goods price inflation, that's yesterday's story. Nobody wants to buy goods anymore because we've all bought bicycles during the pandemic. That's sat there in the hallway, not going to be used for a while because we're off on holiday. So we're not spending on goods, we're spending on services. So that inflation picture, it kind of had two humps. Now, the transitory story of inflation, which was sort of the market consensus for a while, was based on very outdated models that all kind of look at the industrial sector, because that's where all the economic data is, right? Everyone's inflation model that stretches back to the 1970s only has goods data in it because services just wasn't tracked. So all these models showed inflation plummeting sharply, hence the 160 basis point rate cuts being penciled in late last year. Then surprised to see, well, hang on, what's going on with services inflation? This isn't supposed to happen. So we've had this stickiness in the service sector that's caused all these problems. It's still evident there now, but it is starting to wane, starting to see it come down. And it will take a while because a lot of this relates to wage inflation. So if you see headline inflation for 8-9%, your wage bar is going to be at least 6% hopefully, which is what we've seen. But if your headline inflation has come down to sort of the 5%, 4% range, then your wage bargaining is going to be coming down to more normal levels. We're starting to see that. So over the course of this year, as we go into next year, you should see all those wage pressures come down and take some of this heat out the service sector inflation rate. So our expectation is you will see perhaps a couple of rate cuts later on this year in the US and in Europe, but it's still, there's lots of moving parts and we could be frustrated by that. And one of the conversations that everyone's having in the pandemic related to inflation and long-term interest rates, you touched on here, is this whole sustainability side. You're not going to see inflation go back to where it was in 2010. You're not going to see interest rates go back to where they were. And arguably, you shouldn't, right? Because that wasn't a healthy environment, zero interest rate. And the key reasons for that is the lessons we learned on sustainability. This is both supply chain resilience. It's more expensive than it was. You know, it's having all the world's microchips produced by one island off China isn't a sustainable picture. We need to diversify. That costs money. You need, instead of ships going into the US just onto the East Coast, you need them coming into the West Coast as well to safeguard your supply chain. That's more expensive. There's a whole range of things related to geopolitics and the pandemic we learned. You need more resilient, more expensive. Climate change fuels that further. You need more costs, basically, to keep things the same climate perspective. So you can see already here, the cost of living now, in terms of that, sustainability and resilience is more expensive. So for that reason alone, don't expect to see that all will return. We've learned lessons.
Okay. And just also to appreciate the difference between different parts of the world. Obviously, PMI have surveys in the region. Off the top of my head, I think there is UAE, Saudi, Qatar, and Lebanon, the other countries. Well, what are they telling you about the region? What are the key takeaways from these surveys?
Yes, non-oil activity we focus on.
The interesting stuff, yeah.
Yeah. A hotspot, quite literally coming from London. The heat surprised me, but the heat of activity here is very strong, especially in Saudi Arabia, UAE. And so whereas we've got a global PMI that's around the 52 level, anything above 50 is growth. Here you're talking more like 62. So super strong growth this year. And this is being driven by the and tourism, leisure in particular, very strong. You got the manufacturing sector start to turn around. We've got a global inventory cycle. I talked about all that shift away goods to services. Factories got rid of a lot of their raw materials that they'd stocked up on during the pandemic, saved some considerations. So we've gone through 2 years of purely clearing out excess inventory levels. And now we're starting to see that turn around, and that's boosting global manufacturing. So you've got a nice kick from that as well. If there's a problem in the region, it is with that capacity constraint that they're running into supply issues. The Red Sea's complicated that. Here in the UAE in particular, we've got some of the highest growth of backlogs of work, orders that companies can't work through. They've not got capacity to deal with. At the moment, it's that would normally instigate inflation. At the moment, you've got so many competitive pressures here, new entrants coming into the market, keeping those price pressures down. But that's sort of bubbling away. That ability to deal with things in a timely manner is beginning to bite this year, I think.
Interesting. Dr. Mahmoud, I can't have you here without asking about Egypt. Egypt received, it was one of the big macro stories in the region, received a massive international bailout, more than $57 billion, of which $35 billion from the UAE, some IMF, World Bank, EU, everyone is chipping in. Is that amount of international bailout, is that enough to solve Egypt's problems? Do you think Egypt is fine now, or do you think that there are issues?
Well, it depends on how the policies and the institutional and structural reforms are going to be healthy and the economy to be back on track when it comes to high growth and trying to achieve the targets of sustainable development. Some of us could celebrate transactions and we make the news as it happened, and rightly so, after we had seen the deals in Russell Hekma, and then after the 2 reviews of the IMF, and then at the same week almost we get the packet from the EU. Some money was due from other IFIs, including the World Bank and the African Development Bank, start to be released. But for a big economy with a population of 110 million, transactions alone will not make it. Basically about policy coordination, effectiveness of institutions, and keeping an eye at how to pursue high inclusive growth. Because currently we have seen the inflation bouncing between 32 to 40+% coming down. By the end of next fiscal year, we'll be seeing inflation around 15%. Growth will be around 3.5%, 0.5%, depending on certain dynamics. But this is going to be enough, and I'll go back to the lucky figure at the target of 7%, because when inflation comes down, policymakers celebrate that. Commentators say, well, it's better than the double digit if you are in a single digit. But again, the cost of living didn't improve unless you did something better in creation of jobs, in increasing productivity, in investing in high yield, high quality kind of investments. So I think this should really be the path of Egypt going forward. I think that question that raised now would be even more relevant to a time when Egypt graduates from the IMF, which is going to be in 2026. This means that the country had been almost 14 years in that kind of intensive care kind. Going to that is not a pleasure to go there because you have some certain checks that you need to deal with. Some countries have elite programs, and I hope that Egypt is going to be one of the countries that want to benefit from these elite programs as a policy and caution against shocks. But what I would see really, that 18 months from now and 2 years, is that to be manageable. And I think the projections are in that direction. Growth is going to be slightly higher, but wish to be double what we have. inflation needs to be high, but I think we need to have some sophisticated measures because countries in our region and in the global south have mastered the way of handling the hardships of the low income by handouts, by support in tax transfers, and all of that. But we didn't really know yet how to do better with middle class that have been impacted badly by high inflation and lower growth that we need to do more in areas of investments in human capital, education, health, and better services. What we need to see as well, and I mentioned that a couple of times before, that the relationship between Egypt and the IFIs, especially the IMF, had been reduced to issues related to exchange rate flexibility or lack of flexibility. I think it needs to go beyond that, and I'm happy that the government central bank announced that Egypt is pursuing finally and eventually what we hope for almost 20 years now, a full-fledged inflation targeting framework that will be bringing discipline to the public finances, to fiscal discipline with better coordination with monetary policy, and we get rid of exchange rate as an actor of monetary policy, and then the normal question will be about what are we doing with monetary policy, how inflation is behaving, what we are doing in the growth front. So it will be a kind of a normal economic kind of a discussion rather than this kind of crisis talk.
And speaking of countries graduating from the IMF, Egypt obviously is not alone. A country that is addicted to one IMF program after another. And some would say that it's not just Egypt that needs the IMF money. It's also the IMF needs to give Egypt money for Egypt to pay the old IMF loans. And that just doesn't apply to Egypt. That applies to other countries like Pakistan and Argentina, who are in the chain of IMF programs that they seem never able to basically exit. What is going on there? Is it the incorrect prescriptions to these countries, or is it poor implementation of the right policies?
Well, and the history of dealing with different countries in crises, there are many negative and sad stories, but there are many positive stories that do not make the news. Case of Korea, for instance, after the emerging markets crisis, the case of Brazil, the case of Mexico. You can even talk about Greece, but Greece was held beyond the IMF by Europe. And actually, it was interesting to see in the cover of The Economist last year that one of the best performing OECD countries was Greece. So actually, it depends here on what the country and its leadership, when it comes to policy making, are articulating the relationship with the institution. There is a target that I understand from the authorities in Egypt that 26 is going to be a good graduation year, and then it will be the normal article for review kind of relationship. So I would say, yes, there are negative cases, you cited a few of them, that there are many positive cases, including actually Egypt back in 1991, it had a program. And I would say as well, one of the best programs with the IMF, that a program that we didn't have, which is basically a kind of a shadow program, similar very much to what the IMF would offer to you, which was conducted from 2004 to 2008 without the IMF, but based on its discipline, especially fiscal and monetary coordination and discipline, and then going beyond that into inclusive growth. One would have wished that this kind of growth momentum that was between 6 to 7%, as it happened in some successful cases that were cited in Asia, would to grow not just for a couple of years, but we need at least 25 years to do that. But we missed that.
And obviously in 2004, 2008, you were yourself a Minister of Investment in Egypt.
I did like to mention that, but basically, I have to mention, I was not alone. It was the whole country doing that. But Egypt is a country with great potential. I admire really what the minister just mentioned here in the UAE about how to diversify into green, smart opportunities. And I would say that Egypt has perhaps an excellent endowment that can meet matters related to investment and diversifying easier than the UAE. But the UAE is doing it with harder policies, with more determination. I think Egypt can do it, but it needs the same kind of persistence going forward. And I see the signal that there are some good learning from this, but we need to stay the course.
Fantastic. Andrew, let me conclude with you because we're almost out of time. You mentioned the shift in spending among different sectors. Are we also seeing a shift in how consumers are paying for their goods and services? And related to that, are they switching to stuff like cryptocurrency and all these things that we're hearing about?
It's a big question. So we're definitely seeing a shift in how people spend. I mentioned just more broadly, there's a shift to electronic payments, and we've seen with that actually cash on our cards coming down. So it's almost inverted the ratios from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. And what that looks like is a lot more face-to-face contactless payments. So here in the UAE, it's rare, or in Saudi Arabia, it's rare to see anyone not either tap a phone or tap a card to make a payment. There's been a big broad shift to e-commerce as well. In the broader region, it represents around 25% of all retail spend. But consumers still want the best of both worlds. We're seeing those consumers that want to be able to go into physical stores. They want to be able to look at things, test them, maybe buy there, buy at home. So we're definitely seeing, those broader shifts, across the economy. I want to just underscore something Dr. Mahmoud said, which I think is really, really important. I mentioned, there is unevenness in some of the stress that's being experienced in some of the lower income economies. And we've largely talked about this demographic dividend, which we still believe wholeheartedly in. There's a lot of a young generation coming. We think it's critical, though, that this young generation, and Dr. Mahmoud mentioned it, has the skills and abilities to participate. There's still 25% of adults that do not have access to a financial account, don't have skills. Governments are looking to digitize them. We think that the private sector needs to be a partner and play a role in this, because I know right now it doesn't look great, but I believe that it doesn't necessarily turn out that way. So we all need to turn up and really support the younger generation getting the right skills and access to the digital economy, which I think is a good segue into your question around crypto and CBDC. So, at Visa, we want to be the best way to pay and be paid anywhere, and we're continually looking at whatever consumers want to pay with and whatever sellers want to accept. We want to be there, and we want to act, and are acting as a bridge between certainly our traditional retail network versus crypto or CBDCs. I think the reality, so crypto continues to be more of an asset class than actually a transaction currency. And if you just look at these crypto networks themselves, these level 2 networks, they don't have the transaction processing speeds to be able to handle global high retail volume. So we can process over 65,000 transactions per second. Bitcoin, Ethereum, they're at 13 transactions per second. Solana's, I think, around 400 transactions per second. But we see and are acting as a bridge, especially we've been working with Solana to use settlement of stablecoin across that network. The other big area is around central bank digital currencies. I think there's about 130 countries across the globe that are looking at it, have projects. We've done 40 pilots to date with different governments. I think one which exemplifies a real use case that a government wanted is something that happened in Kazakhstan a few months ago. So the government decided they wanted to have a digital tenge, which is their currency. And their use case was they wanted to be able to push that digital tenge to pay government employees with the digital tenge. But they realized that you need to be able to have a way to then access your digital tenge. You want to go, to an ATM and get physical tenge. You want to be able to go to the grocery store. So they've got that, and they've married that with Visa credentials. So I think you're going to see more of these use cases where you've got central bank digital currencies, but tapping in and harnessing existing infrastructure to be able to bring them to life.
Fantastic. Andrew, Dr. Mahmoud, Chris, thank you so much for an excellent panel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent presentation.